On all of our platforms, we use the saying, take personal responsibility. And there's nothing I love more than being able to use an example or a story to add context to what that means to us. So before I go into this conversation, I just want to set some housekeeping rules that the creation of this video is not so that we can all comment on what we think happened. This video is to provide context to something that happened, and then figuring out where we can take personal responsibility in our own lives and communities. So providing more of that micro aspect of taking a bigger scenario and then pulling it back into our personal lives. So just want to keep that clear, that this video is not for just us to like gossip about what we think happened. Okay, so we're just going to jump into it, and then I'm going to talk about areas where there's potential context for this scenario. So earlier on last week, there was an accusation that got put out on the internet all over Instagram, and it was accusing somebody who's very, very big, very famous in the 2A community, of doing something that was very inappropriate with one of his female shooter employees. And so apparently, as the story goes, a disgruntled ex-employee took some videos off of his phone and then uploaded them to the internet, and it was him acting inappropriately with his female shooter. And so one of our friends sent us a text message that led us to a YouTube video where somebody else in the 2A community was basically just telling their thoughts on what they had seen. So it was just an opinion-based YouTube video, and then in the description of that video, he provided a link to the actual video that got leaked so that you could kind of check it out for yourself. And so we watched the YouTube video, and I went and watched the videos that got leaked. And at first, I think most of us, right, we're going to see something and we're going to have like this instant thoughtless assumption or opinion on what we think could have happened. So the first thing that popped up in my mind was, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. And so that's just like my natural instinct. So then we texted our friend back, and then we ended up having this discussion through text messages. So there was like the instant, check this out, and then it was like, boom, my thoughts were, wouldn't be surprised if this happened. And then we started to ask questions. So our friend asked me what I thought about it, and I just said, I have no context for this entire scenario, so it is impossible for me to formulate any type of like factual opinion. I have never met the person who owns that company that got accused. I have never met the female shooter. I have no idea what their work environment looks like. I have no idea if him and her were already sleeping together. I don't have any idea if she was into it or if she felt uncomfortable and just kind of went with it because she was afraid of losing her job. Like there was so little information on what actually happened or what had been going on for the past several years, that it was impossible for me to make any sort of fact-based opinion. And so we just went through that in the text messages, and then we started going into conversations of like what we believe the standard should be within the 2A community, within, you know, a workplace, where like what your relationship standards should be between an employer and an employee. So then it kind of just turned into us talking about like, what's my opinion as a female? Like, where is it hard for me? What things have happened in the past that I'm like, yeah, I totally understand where she's coming from if it happened like this. So it's just like this conversation got opened up for talking about what we thought or how things can be within different industries and what we believe the standards should be. But the point is, our friend and us who had the conversation through text messages, it could have stopped at us saying like, oh, what a douchebag, I'm not even surprised that this happened. And then like, that's the end of it, right? Like we make up our opinion of what we think happened and then that's the end of it. But no, you can't stop there. We have to keep going and we have to look at the context. And then that's part of taking personal responsibility. We get so upset for what happens in the media. And I know this is true for a lot of us. Like we get really frustrated with the lack of evidence and how things are just like emotionally stirred up. And so if we're getting frustrated that other people are doing it, then we need to get frustrated with ourselves when we're doing it in our personal lives. And so it's really important that after that thoughtless first impression of what we think about something, we have to take it further and then start providing context and asking questions and just formulating deeper thoughts and perspective on what potentially could have gone on, especially when we don't have the information. So that was part one of taking, just putting more context into it and allowing yourself to take personal responsibility in your thought process when you hear of accusations where you don't actually have any of the information or you weren't there and saw it happen. And so the next step is, so hold on, we got the brain fart. Okay. So the next part is taking scenarios like this and instead of, so what I did too is I saw all these videos, I went through a lot of the comments and it's just a lot of normal stuff like people have already decided what they believe happened or just all this, whatever. And so as I was reading through those, I was thinking to myself like, okay, so when we take scenarios like this, like what can we learn from them or what kind of standards can we set up in our own lives based off of what we wish we would have seen from that person who's very, very big in the 2A community, right? And so I think that's the next step is when it's so easy to just make accusations or to think that we know what's happening in other people's lives. But then it's like, but do we even know what's happening in our lives? So like, let's use their story and their example, and then let's go check ourselves. So for example, a lot of what happened in this last week with the accusation didn't have to happen. He didn't have to have videos of him and his female shooter employee. So those videos never would have gotten leaked if there weren't videos to begin with. He could have had standards set up in place as the employer that he didn't allow himself to be alone with his female employees, especially in the workplace, or that he didn't allow himself to have relationships with his female employees. So there's all these standards that could have been set into place that would have made this scenario not happen. And so, so you go back to your own personal life and you're like, okay, where could I take personal responsibility in my life to make sure that I'm protecting myself from things happening like that in my life? And I think this is an easy area where some of us it's very easy to judge other people because we've never caught ourselves in these scenarios, but that's not to say that they couldn't happen. And so based off of the information that I've always been taught by other people, especially growing up, I always ask questions to couples who had been married for several years and were still best friends and they had a really good relationship. I always wanted to get as much information from them on how they did things and how they made things work. And one of the things I was always taught from several couples is that setting up boundaries prior to things happening is one of the things that really kept them from finding themselves closer and closer to that boundary line, right? So, for example, Derek and I do not have work meetings with the opposite sex alone. We just don't do it. And if there was a scenario where one of us needed to have a work meeting with somebody of the opposite sex, the only way that would be okay is if we were to meet with them in a public place and the other spouse already knew about it and had approved the meeting. And some people, it's funny because some people are like, oh, that's like so paranoid. Like, you obviously don't trust your spouse. It's like, no, it has nothing to do with that. You're setting up boundaries, and you're setting standards so that you are protecting yourself from getting closer and closer to that line. So I look at this scenario, and it's in my own life. Where can I take personal responsibility? It's things like that. It's not meeting with someone of the opposite sex alone where you don't know what's happening in people's lives. And so it's like, if you keep yourself out of those scenarios, then chances of them happening are very, very slim. So that's another thing. Like, what can we take away from this scenario that just happened in somebody else's life that we don't know them? And then how can we apply that to our own life and take personal responsibility for our life? Because we can't control what's happening out in California at some big 2A firearms training company, right? We have no control over him or how he, what standards he has set in place for himself and his employees. But we do have control over how we set the standards for ourselves and our households and our family and our businesses. So that's another point, is just using somebody else's scenario to not bash them and write your comments about what you think about what they did. I think it's just so easy to do that, but we're all going to find ourselves in scenarios one way or the other. They may not all look the same, but we're definitely we're human, we're fallible, we fall short, and we're going to make mistakes. And so I just think it's really helpful to use other people's scenarios to see where you can set up better boundaries for yourself. So that was the main point of just bringing some context to this situation and all of this stuff that's going on the internet, and where we can use all of these scenarios to become better versions of ourselves by really digging deeper into the context of the situation. So that was today's scenario of taking personal responsibility and what we mean by that. If you want to talk about your opinions on what you believe happened or didn't happen, if you even know what I'm talking about, like, there are so many different threads on Instagram where you can do that. It's definitely not the point of this video, but something to think about. And you don't have to comment you don't have to comment on this video, but something to think about is, where can you take better personal responsibility in your own life when you see things like this pop up, where other people are being accused of things, whether or not they did it? If they did do it, where can you take personal responsibility to make sure that those things don't happen in your life? If they didn't do it, where can you take better personal responsibility in your life to make sure that things like that aren't getting leaked on the internet about your life? So, thoughts to think about.